namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Pranic Healing podcast. On this episode, we have Gabriel Morner. Gabriel has been in pranic healing for about 25 years. He is a senior level Arhatic yoga practitioner and pranic healer as well. And on this episode, we're going to talk about the differences between the emotional body and the mental body, and why that's very important when it comes to not only healing a certain condition or disease, but practical life advice as well. So please welcome Gabriel. All right.
Good
So
evening.
welcome to the podcast, Gabriel.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very much.
for your time. Yeah, so I know I gave you a little introduction about yourself. I know you have a lot more to your background and history. So for the audience, Gabriel, please just tell us a little bit about yourself, how, your story and how you got into pranic healing, and then we'll sort of jump into the main topic for today, which is about the emotional body and the mental body and its differences.
Okay. Um, Thank you for the introduction. I started my life in Manhattan from Swedish parents, and at age 6, we moved back to Sweden. When I look back at that, I can say that that was very good. Sweden is a much less dense country and lots of space. So as I went through school and I did, when I came to seeking my university studies, I came back to America. And I've always had a great curiosity for how things work. And that curiosity led me into spiritual practices. So, I mean, I was raised Christian, but I was very curious about, other spiritual practices and religion. So I started in the late 70s doing some Japanese Zen. And I did that for about,
And how old were you during this time?
so I was 21.
21. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, prior to that, I did study a little bit of Hinduism, and a classmate of mine when I was 15 said, "Oh, we're gonna go meditate with a yogi." This was in Stockholm. So we go and we go down in the basement, and it's like really old building and vaulted, and here's this Indian yogi, you know, that we're supposed to meditate with. And I didn't know anything about meditation, and so he's just sitting silently, and we're supposed to sit there. And I mean, that's what we call the
Yeah.
Dhyana meditation. Um, so that was my first introduction to spirituality, although I was very confused. So anyway,
Okay. So it
uh,
sounds like if I can recap for the audience, it sounds like you were very spiritually curious at a young age, and you grew up in Manhattan, New York, but flew back to Sweden, and
yeah,
that's where you had your childhood, and that's where you had these first spiritual experiences. So just to give everyone context,
yeah,
okay.
and Sweden, you know, Sweden is compared to you know India and Egypt, or which are some of the older cultures. Uh, I mean, it's only 10,000 years ago that the ice broke, and so the Swedish, Vikings, we're not that old, so we don't have such
Hmm.
deep spiritual practices. So when I came over to America, and I was aware of Zen Buddhism, and so I found a place in Los Angeles, um, and I stayed with that for about 5 years. Then I studied some more Hinduism, and eventually also Kabbalah. And the only problem was that the the practice in some of these old spiritual practices was that if you wanted to go really deep into the practice, like in Zen, you would have to become a monk. Or if Kabbalah, you want to do the deeper practice, you have to convert to Judaism. And
Yeah.
neither of those options were palatable to me. when I ran
no
into
freedom in that.
pranic healing, I can say that this was the first practice where how far you go is dependent on you, dependent on your desire and your self-discipline. So there wasn't any, you didn't have to uh, join a religious faculty for it. So this gave me the possibility for depth and learning without those constraints. So
So just to kind of get a recap, what was like your goal or purpose or intention to studying all these different spiritual practices? Because
well,
everyone has a different reason for following a certain faith or practice. But what was your? Because I know you said in the beginning, growing up, you were very spiritually inclined to study and
right.
understand these things.
Insatiable curiosity, wanting to know how things work, and understanding that there are workings beyond our physical self, and that's what the spiritual studies gave me an understanding for the energy that we surround ourselves with and that we are affected by. Because you can say, like a very simple analogy is like a magnet has a very strong energetic field around it. We as bioelectric beings, meaning, we have electrical impulses, that's how our nerves work. So we also have an energy field around us. And and we access this energy through spiritual practices. So it kept me driving to understand more and more until I would hit a block. Then I would go to the next discipline. Spent another 4 or 5 years, hit a block. And these blocks were basically, if you want to continue, you have to be, part of the club, so to speak. You have to become Jewish. You have to become a monk. And I understand these limitations because in the past history, many of these teachings were secret. We're today in an environment where these secrecies are now being revealed. So when I came to pranic healing, it was a big relief that you know I, I didn't have to like sign up to a doctrine and become a priest or whatever in order to have access to these teachings. And during my study in pranic healing and arhatic yoga, which now is 24 years plus, the understanding some of the differences in how I am communicating, and that brings us to this topic of what's the difference between the emotions and the intellect, or as in pranic healing we call it emotional body versus mental body.
Hmm.
So
Okay, and just to recap for the audience, so it sounds like again, these different spiritual practices and faiths, it's almost like you're signing like a commitment to not only start but to get to those deeper teachings. But pranic healing, as we know, is first an energy healing practice, but it has the spiritual teachings part very open, very simple, very easy to understand, very accessible. And it helped you kind of connect the dots, it sounds like, between all the spiritual practices you studied. And then, which will lead to our topic, which we'll be discussing the emotional and mental body. Is that
right,
is that a correct summary?
yeah,
Okay. Okay,
yeah. So
so now we're in the realm of pranic healing, and you were talking about the mental and the emotional body. So for the audience, Gabriel, because a lot of people can understand emotions and thoughts, but what do you mean when there's an emotional body and a mental body? Because I thought we just
yeah,
have one physical body.
as um, So that brings into the topic the soul. Some people believe that there's a soul, and some people don't believe that there's a soul. But um, as we through any religion or any spiritual practice, and in pranic healing, we do make that distinction. So the physical body, the emotions, and the intellect are tools for the soul to operate in this physical world. In other words, our teacher, Grandmaster Shoakok Sui, very often made these analogies, like he said, the carpenter is not the chair.
Mm.
So just because we engage in an activity, it doesn't make us that activity. If I get in a car and drive it, I don't believe that I am the car. It's very simple for us to separate ourselves from the car. But the bond between our soul and our three bodies, as we call them, physical, emotional, and mental, the bond is so close that we're not clear about the distinction. So some people will say, it's like, no, but that's how I feel. And that's an identity that, look, it's like, don't bug me about that. This is who I am. I feel this way. And when we look at to understand why we may be at a certain stage, like, am I driven by my emotions or am I driven by my intellect? We also have to understand, like, what's the progression, what develops when. So
Right.
when we're a child below age 3, we're driven like 100% by emotions. That's why we call it the terrible twos. When the kid wants that thing, they're going to throw a tantrum if they don't get it. And not until after age 3 can we actually have a dialogue with the child. So our mental capacity starts to build. So as we enter into adulthood, depending on um, the quality of our environment, meaning, did we have a supportive environment or did we have a very stressed environment? Then the development of our emotions or development of our mind will vary. So a person who comes out of a very, you know, stressful and contesting environment will most often be tend towards emotions. So
Mm.
to put it into a very practical term is that if if I react emotionally, um, it usually is going to lead to more arguments, or even that's like, oh, why did I do that? And what we need to do as humans, and this is our unique capacity. The intellect is a unique capacity. The animal kingdom, they don't have a developed cognition. So we have to understand that. Um, and if we are to make the most of want to make the most of my capacity and to learn, I have to learn to manage my emotions. And and that will come down in several ways. Like, okay, um, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to count to 10 and just breathe calmly, and hopefully the emotions will settle down and I can actually have this conversation, even though it's a
Mm.
difficult one for me.
Mm.
Uh,
Okay.
so
So just to kind of recap for the audience, because I know you said a lot, right? But I want to make sure the audience understands
yeah,
this. So, from the context in trying to describe the difference between the emotional body and the mental body, you brought up the term the soul, right? And the soul, of course, is a it's a very broad term, but basically we're not just this bag of flesh and meat. That there is something higher that is animating this body, which is a vehicle. And I like the terms that you mentioned, like the soul is like the carpenter, but these bodies are like the tools that it it uses to function on this physical plane. And part of those bodies, those vehicles, is the emotional body and the mental body. Something that I like to also compare it to is like a carriage, right? A carriage with three horses. So you have your physical horse, you have your emotional horse, and you have your mental horse. And sometimes, the mental horse wants to go this way, the emotional horse wants to go that way, and that's what you're describing, right?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to managing these three vehicles, it's very important in distinguishing that they are separate. Because you mentioned a lot of people are identified with their emotions, right? I feel this way. I am this way because I feel this way. I am this way because I think this way. But the very key term I want the audience to understand is that all these things, when you're feeling an emotion, when you're thinking a thought, these are just another tool for the soul, another vehicle for the soul to operate on this
Yeah.
plane. Okay. Is that correct? Does that
Yeah. No,
summarize everything?
that's a very good summary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. Please
So
continue.
the other thing to realize is okay, we have three bodies. We have the physical body, emotional, and the mental, and each one of those bodies represents a different level of evolution. So when we look at the animals, it's like the physical and emotional. The mental development comes in as humans, and that's what separates us from the animals, and it gives us the opportunity to 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 go from reactive behavior to proactive behavior. And
What does that mean for the audience?
so
What does
reactive
proactive
meaning
behavior mean?
somebody bumps into you and you lash out. That's reactive behavior.
That's emotional.
Somebody says something you don't like and you bark back at them. That's reactive
Mhm.
behavior. Proactive behavior will be, it's like somebody bumps into you. It's like, actually, I don't know why they bumped into me. It could be that they didn't see me. And so
Mhm.
uh, maybe I apologize instead. And what you find is then you get a totally different reaction from the other person. Somebody
Mhm.
bumped into me and I say, hey, watch where you're going. More than likely, they're also going to have a reactive behavior back. Like 9 out of 10 times, it's going to be reactive back. So um, th- this is, I mean, for a long time, this is since pranic healing. I started pranic healing energetic yoga, it's become an exercise to be more conscious about not allowing my emotions to dictate my life. In other words,
Mhm.
to give a historical context, when 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 we were, before we became really civilized and we were living in the wild, the reactive behavior was super important for our survival. Like it was fight or flight.
Right.
And if I wasn't alert to that, I wouldn't live very long. Now, the problem is we still have those biological functions. In other words, we get triggered, the fight or flight comes up. And now it's up to our mental capacity to talk to ourselves and say, well, he probably didn't mean it. Or maybe there's another reason. I don't really need to be reactive here, or I don't really need to, to run away. Because if somebody comes up and argues with me, it's not a fight or flight situation. My life isn't dependent on this reactive behavior, but it's still there biologically. So this is what we have to deal with, and why this is the reason why it's a challenge and work to become proactive and to limit our reactive behavior.
And I just wanted to just clarify with what you just said. The fight or flight response is exactly what you said, is an evolutionary uh, biological response built into our nervous system. That's called for the audience, that's called the sympathetic nervous system. So like Gabriel said, when there's like a tiger that runs into you, right, it's either fight or flight, right? Because if you don't do anything, you're dead meat, and that's not a good way of continuing the human species. So biologically, it basically activates our nervous system. Blood pressure goes up, our eyes get dilated, and we run away, right? And that's what again, what Gabriel's mentioning is that also comes up when someone has an argument with us, on the highway, right? And that also comes up, but that's a very, like Gabriel said, it's a reactionary type of response, whereas the mental body can kind of manage that and sees a bigger picture and has context. So it goes back to the evolutionary development of the human body, and the central nervous system, in addition to what we're talking about, the emotional body and the mental body. So I think that's a really great point, because a lot of people get confused, because when they are reactionary, they think that, oh, it's them, it's themselves, it's their I, right? It's their thoughts, it's their emotions, and it's their body acting at the same time. Whereas it's actually their emotional body that is reacting to this, and it's sort of controlling the physical body to react this way. Okay, so that's just for context for the audience.
No, good. Very good summary. So I was looking for ways to, okay, so what are some methods to sort of calm the emotional body? To say, no, it's okay, we don't have to react here, and to engage in a more compassionate and more mental way. So when I first came back to America, the late 70s, I took Tai Chi. And Tai Chi, being a Chinese martial art, that it's it's really about not opposing a force coming at you. Because if there's a force coming and you push back on it, now you have conflict. But if a force comes and you simply step to the side, and the force will expend itself. So once I started to do pranic healing and arhatic yoga, I was using that as a model for dialogue. So the first time I could say the first time I successfully used it was um, I was working in an office, and there's another guy who I was we were cooperating on a few things, and then he thought I had dropped the ball, so he was approaching me in the hallway. I could see he was red in his face, and he was gearing up for a fight. So he came at me and he started barking at me, and so I applied the Tai Chi methodology, and I said, "I'm so happy that you brought that up. I really want to talk about this." But knowing that if I engaged then and there, I would probably start yelling at him back. So I first I complimented him, and then I said, "But right now I have a meeting. How about we meet tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.?" And the result on him was like all the wind went out of him. You could see
Hmm.
the red in his face went away, his shoulders slumped, and he said, "Okay." So it's like all of that,
Interesting.
and that was because I chose to allow his projection of anger. It's almost like I step aside mentally, let it pass, and then I compliment him, and
Ah,
it creates a big confusion in the person, because it's like that's not the way a fight is supposed to go.
they're not expecting that. Yeah.
And so this was, but it requires some self knowledge, that to understand when these emotions start to boil up and to catch them before it explodes. And that's the work. And it's not easy. I mean, it requires self discipline. And when
Okay.
we do things like
It
meditation,
definitely, right. Is Before we go on to that topic, I just wanted to review what you just said, because I think you brought up, in managing with those emotional confrontations from another person, you brought up a very powerful tool using Tai Chi as the symbolism, or context behind it, right? When someone's very angry and their energetic emotions, it's coming at you. You basically practice the Tai Chi method, like you said, they projected an emotional comment or whatever words at you, and you kind of deflected it. You gave them a compliment, which is no one expects that, right? And you allowed that energy to pass, to dissipate. So, and I think that's a very powerful tool that not a lot of people one are aware of. But like you said, the context is that we have this emotional body, and this emotional body is not connected to us. It's a separate vehicle, and it can be managed, whether it's our emotions or emotions with other people, because it doesn't have to be this reactionary, like you punch me, I punch you, you say something bad, I say something bad to you. It can be managed in a way that both sides can work out, or at least for you in yourself, right? Because you're the one that's trying to maintain your own healthy state. um, so I just wanted to make that clear for the
Yeah.
audience, because that was an example of a practice and a tool for us to kind of disengage from a conflict before it rises.
Yeah. I would say that I call it verbal Tai Chi.
Verbal Tai
That's the
Chi.
name I gave it. So
Yeah,
it's really a
verbal Tai
verbal
Chi.
Tai Chi
Nice.
exercise, and it's one that requires some practice and some self discipline. And it out of the three basic ways I think to respond to negative energy coming towards us, the verbal Tai Chi is the most evolved way because
Mm.
it takes. I mean, if somebody triggers you, you're going to compliment them. It's like most people are going to say, "What's that all about?" But it's understanding that I'm not giving anything away. I'm just allowing that energy
Uh,
to dissipate, and
and it
also
sounds like,
to cause the
yeah.
source to suddenly, like, there's no energy in that source anymore. What do I do with a compliment?
Mm.
So it's an interesting one, because and that's, I would say, out of the three. Talk about the two others, much simpler, but that one is more evolved. And it's something we have to
Oh,
practice at. I can say that really, really good practice to develop that capacity is to engage in some kind of martial arts. And I think that Tai Chi is probably best suited for that. So
okay.
um,
Um, yeah, because I just wanted to reiterate, when you mentioned the word verbal Tai Chi, right? It's very interesting, because you mentioned that you have to first understand, you have to know the context of what you're working with, the emotional body. But it sounds like you need that mental body, right? That higher thinking, higher order, to even understand that, oh, there's a situation going on that might get reactionary.
yeah,
And like what you did, you threw a compliment at the person, which confused them, mentally and emotionally, and dissipated that, allowed that energy to pass by and go through.
yeah,
And another example you used was the physical Tai Chi, which is what you mentioned in the beginning, which is a form of martial arts where it's, you're not reacting, you're not pushing against the force, you're allowing that force to pass through, and almost, what it reminds me of is just like flowing like water, like flowing
yeah,
through an object, right? Like a rock.
yeah,
You're not forcing through that rock, you're just going around it.
yeah. And once we have stepped aside, now we have the ability to direct it. So
Mm.
giving the compliment is an act of compassion. That knowing how to do the practice is mental, but complimenting them or thanking them is the compassionate aspect. And now they've lost their rudder, so to speak, and
Right, their
that's
momentum.
why he accepted meeting tomorrow at 9 o'clock. So in other
And
words, he
did
came
he
into
actually
this.
meet with you at 9 o'clock?
Yeah, 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 and
He did.
and
Okay.
and then he understood that his attitude. It's like he thought there was something that I was responsible for, but he was responsible for it. And once we actually
Yeah.
sat down and talked without the emotions, he conceded and went back and took care of it. But if I had confronted him and just said, it's like, that's not my responsibility, and barked back at him, it
Right.
would have been the championship in the office, you know. So,
Right.
but that,
So,
so that's where we want to get to, and it requires a lot of self-discipline to be able to do that.
mhm.
And by that
And
time,
you mentioned yeah. I was gonna say you mentioned self-discipline because I want to get to I know we've been talking about the emotional body, but I want to talk about the mental body too,
yeah,
to give context for the audience too. And I'm sure you're leading up to that because, like you said, 80% of humans or people are operating on their emotions or the emotional body,
yeah,
which
they're
is
driven by
equivalent
their
to
emotions.
right. They're driven by their emotions, which is again an evolutionary part of our biology and how
Yeah,
we function, psychologically. But for the context for the audience, what is the mental body and how does that come in? Because we described it a little bit in terms of the
right.
situation we talked about. But in simple terms for the audience, what does that mean to also have a mental body operating?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give a definition for a very simple definition for the emotional body and then for the mental body so we can see the difference. So the emotional body, the faculty of the emotional body is communication. The purpose of the emotional body is communication. And the language of the emotional body is feelings. So that means when I have a feeling, I'm picking up some vibration. And we have this error. I call it an error because it's lack of understanding. I just want to be happy. And no, I don't like that. I don't want to be sad. I just want to be happy. And if feelings is a language, that and we take it to English and say, no, I can't use those words. I only want happy words. It would really severely limit our capacity to communicate. So if I'm going to say, okay, these feelings are on the high podium, and these feelings I don't want to deal with, they go in the trash. I'm going to be very limited in my ability to understand what's coming at me.
Hmm.
So in other words, there are no good or bad feelings. They're telling me something. And when we look at the animal world, I mean, they're like 99% emotions, and we have this saying: an animal can smell your fear. No, they don't smell it, but they feel the emotions that you're putting out. So the faculty of the emotions is communication, and the language is feelings. Now, the mental body, the intellect, the faculty of the intellect is judgment. Yes, no, good, bad, up, down. Without the faculty of judgment, we wouldn't have a smartphone, we wouldn't have airplanes, rockets, spaceships, whatever. That cannot be developed with emotions. It requires the mental capacity, the capacity of judgment. So when it will appear if a person is operating mainly emotionally and they interact with a person who's mainly operating mentally, they may find the person very insulting because they'll be very straightforward and point out, it's like, yeah, no, you can't do that because this and this happens, whatever. And it will not jive with the person's feelings. So we have a disconnect there. But it requires a lot of self-discipline to, number one, accept and understand the limits of emotions. And that if we want to, you know, shall we say, graduate fully into the possibility of humanity, we have to apply self-discipline and learn to when and how we use the mental body.
Mm.
But one of the
Okay.
most important things is that we have to maintain compassion. If we don't maintain compassion, but only develop the mental body, then you get a tyrant. I mean, then you have harsh criticism and harshness, and dictators are like that. So,
So it sounds like a balance is needed between the mental and the emotional. Like they're working together.
right. So this relationship between the emotions and the mental is like uh, most of us, me including, until I took a deep dive into this spiritual practice, was to react to things, and then wondering why that person didn't like me, or why things were unfair, or whatever the internal dialogue may be. Um, that it's it's difficult. It's a challenge, I should say, to understand when I'm making a judgment from my emotions, meaning I like that emotion, I don't like that emotion, versus the mind is a challenge too. And what the model that I have come upon or discovered is that I know when I'm making a decision, a judgment using my emotions, if if I'm justifying it mentally. So most of the
Mm.
time when we go into a mental justification for something, usually there's a thought in the back of our mind. So it's like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that, but no, I need to do it because I like it. It makes me feel better. Da, da, da. So we have to be alert. That's one place where we can discover uh, this dichotomy between the two. Is that if
Mm.
we're making justifications and rationale for something, we should take a closer look at it. So
Okay. That's a great description, and I again want to rewind back to what you first define the emotional body and the mental body for the audience, because you describe the function of the emotional body as to communicate, right? And you said the language of the emotional body is through feelings, right? And then the function of the mental body is judgment, correct?
yeah,
To differentiate, black, white, good, bad,
yeah.
things like that, right? And the I don't know if you mentioned a language for the mental body, but is there like a language that the mental body functions on, just like the how feelings are the language for the emotional body? I just wanted to
I would
clarify
say
that.
I would say that I haven't really thought about it, but what comes to mind is abstraction.
And what does that mean?
So abstraction, like math, that's abstraction. And
Mm.
I mean, if you're doing math, it's like 1 + 1 is 2. It's not whatever you feel like. It's 2. That's abstraction, and that's also the quantity of judgment. That's a 1. Okay, that plus means I'm going to put it together, and there's another 1. So that's judgment. I'm making judgment on that and that's high abstraction. Is math is high abstraction.
So it sounds like, yeah, like a very logical
Yeah,
quantity order to it. There's a structure. It can't be. There's no right or wrong. It's just
right.
this.
I mean, you can say
That's how
that
it works. Okay.
logic is probably a better definition of the language. So the
Okay.
language
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Logic.
the mental body is logic.
Logic. Right.
The
Okay.
faculty,
And that goes into, yeah,
the
because
faculty is the judgment, and the language
mhm.
is logic.
Mm, okay. And what I was going to say about that, because going into logic of the mental body, you know something that I find a lot of people get fumbled over is common sense, right? And would you say common sense is like the bare minimum that the mental body functions on, or is there also some part of the emotional body that relates to common sense? Because
So,
that's a
so
word that everyone uses.
yeah, I mean, common sense is sort of a misnomer because common sense harks back to the emotional body.
Okay.
Commonality and sense. Now, the word the words we use in our language is very important because it reveals what the where I'm operating. So the word sense is also very, very synonymous to feeling. So sense and
Mm,
feeling are synonyms. So if it's commonality of feelings is another way to describe common sense. And unfortunately, common sense is used as a defense for logic.
okay. Can you give us an example?
So, I have a very strong feeling that something is right and it should be done this way. And then the other person is rejecting it and we end up in an argument. I say, it's like, what don't you understand? This is common sense. But I'm actually taking an example that is based on my emotions and my traditions or whatever, and then I'm trying to convince the person by claiming it as common sense. It may be common
Okay.
sense from the culture that I come from. It's common
Right.
in that realm, and there we have these feelings that makes that right behavior. But now I go to another country, it's like, what are you talking about? Are you insane? We don't do that kind of stuff here.
Okay. Can we ground the example like something physical that like the audience can understand? Like let's say like building a bike, right? Common sense is you have one wheel in the front, one wheel in the back, right? But it
Right.
sounds like if other cultures if they have three wheels, right? Well, maybe it's a tricycle, they might not seem like it's common sense to have two wheels in the back. Is that
Correct.
a
Yeah.
good way to describe
Yeah.
that? Right?
Because common sense is very much related to your culture and the feelings or beliefs around that culture. And so it's a bit of a misnomer and it's used quite a lot. But
Mm,
but but then there's this expression, common sense is neither. And
mm,
that's an interesting note to common sense, because to say that it's like come on, it's common sense. There is no logic there to support it. We're just using it as a battering ram
mm.
to make the person agree
Okay.
with the position that I'm taking. It may be common sense
Okay.
to
So
me,
yeah.
but it's not common sense to them. They come from a different place. So
Right.
so
So
it's
it sounds like it's the communication of this of an idea that is not because like you mentioned the cultural difference or geographic differences they might not have had that exposure to this idea and therefore your one person's idea of common sense is different from another's and that's why they
yeah,
would use common sense as a battering ram to say okay here's my argument this is common sense.
right.
Is that correct in how I'm framing it?
Yeah. Although I try to refrain from using common sense because it's not very helpful. I mean, to say that something is
Right.
common sense makes nothing to help the person understand,
Understand.
right?
Okay.
So it
And what will help the person understand, as to kind of
well,
push forward? What
just we
can
would
we
have
do to connect and help them understand?
yeah we would have a dialogue about it and express knowledge about it, and if I can describe it properly, there may be an understanding and vice versa.
So the
So
same thing with your conversation with that person in the past that had
right,
almost an argument with you. You
yeah.
kind of sat them down, had a conversation.
I mean, it's like if I had pulled the common sense out of my bag,
Right.
it just would have been a screaming match
Yeah.
because it explains nothing. It actually it's a put down of the other person.
Mhm.
It's like, no, you're too dumb to
Right. Because it
understand it
kind of
because this is common sense.
puts you on a pedestal versus
Yes.
them
Yeah, I
looking
know
down.
something you don't know. How come you don't know that? That's common sense. So
Right.
it can
Yeah.
be, even if we don't put it in that way that I put it, which is obviously offensive, just
Mm.
to say that it's common sense is a put down of the other person.
Okay. And I think that's a beautiful way to describe it for the audience because I think many people associate common sense with just being mental, like logical,
Right.
right? But
It's
as
mostly,
you've highlighted, there's way more to that. There's that emotional
yeah,
feeling
it's actually
connection
mostly
too.
feeling. And
Yeah.
also I've noticed that there's many cases where people have said it's common sense because they don't know how to describe the event.
Mm.
So if they do not have the ability or knowledge of, well, why is it this way, they will retreat and shield themselves with the expression common sense. So that's another way that
So
is used.
can you give us an example using the bike as an example again? Like
So it's like it's like what don't you understand? Two wheels. You get on it, you hold your balance. It's like that's how it works. It's common sense. But they've
right.
never seen
I see.
two-wheel bike before. They only know
There
three-wheel.
you go. Yeah.
That would be a way. I mean,
Because they've been riding on 3 wheels, they didn't need to learn how to balance,
right.
right? But if you
Yeah.
ride on 2 wheels, you need to learn to balance.
Yeah.
So
So
that's
it
another.
becomes, it's like, it's like, when we're growing up, like by age 5 or 6, it's like you may venture onto two wheels. Before
Right,
that, you're on three
right.
wheels, you know. So
Yeah.
it also
So
is
that's a great
a
example.
level of competence. So, but anyway, the 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 one way to deal with the rising emotions is the verbal Tai Chi, and uh,
Mhm,
it's more advanced because we're using compassion by complimenting them.
mhm.
If I'm purely
I
reactive, it's
see.
like it's gonna be really difficult. I'm not going to compliment them; they're being a jerk, right? So
Right.
that's where we would like to get to.
Yeah.
The
And just to kinda, for the audience, because I think the audience doesn't really understand compassion can be used in many different ways, but it sounds like compassion is the medium or the bridge between the mental and the emotional, because you
Yeah,
see the greater context of things, and you're gonna like you saw it. You're not gonna reactionary, emotionally fire at the person, but because you see the greater mental context, the bigger picture, using compassion, you're able to, like verbal tai chi,
yeah.
kind of disignite and calm the situation down.
I mean, if we act from the mental capacity without compassion, if we don't add any compassion to it, it becomes excessively judgmental
Mhm.
because judgment is a faculty of the mental capacity. So we have to temper it with compassion, and that's why in pranic healing, where service is like a very, very important thing. To do service for other people, to make donations is activation of our compassion. And
Mhm.
I know that it's like why should I give something to them? It's like he's always a jerk to me. So there is resistance. For some people, it's the easiest thing to do. For some people, it's difficult to do. I mean, the more difficult it is, the more important it is, and the more benefit there will be.
That's a great way to put it because again, we think the opposite. The harder it is, we think, "Oh, that's not for us. That's doesn't
Right.
help us at all." But you mentioned it's actually the most important thing for us because
Yeah.
that's an area that we lack or need to
But it,
develop.
it
Is that
relates to
correct?
stress. If there's no stress, there is no growth, period. And now that we are capable of going to space, there's a very good example. When an astronaut goes up to the ISS for 10 months, when they come back, they have 4% less bone density. And even lifting
Mm,
a 5 pound object, it feels like 100 pounds. So without the stress of gravity, their body has become really weak. So if there's no stress, there's no growth. And for those who
that's a
find compassion
physical example.
a really difficult thing, they're the ones who make the biggest gains
Mm,
when they do it.
I see.
So
I think that that applies in so many areas. Like when you want to build muscle, you got to work out, right? You have to go against the resistance
right,
of that weight to build that muscle. Same thing emotionally and mentally, right? When you want to be emotionally stronger, you have to go through challenging situations where you tame and manage your emotions. When you become want to become mentally stronger, right? You study, you read books, you learn, and that's how you mentally get better, so so
yeah,
called. So I like the how we can again differentiate all the different bodies and how we can use stress, right, to get stronger.
yeah,
Because initially, a lot of people think that stress is bad. Stress is we shouldn't have stress. We should just be at peace all the time. But
right,
if we do that, we're not going to grow. We're just going to be, you know, we're going to. There's no reason for the body to evolve in that
yeah.
case.
So it requires self-discipline to number one, recognize it's like, oh, that's my comfort zone. I want to learn something. Okay, I have to go over here and create some stress. And if I'm uncomfortable, it's okay. I'm learning something. So
Mm,
when I came probably like 2 years or so into pranic healing, that this sort of started to come to clarity to me.
mm,
And what I but I didn't know really how to verbalize it or explain it. And for most people, if they're in their emotions more than their mind, then it wouldn't help to explain it. So I had this thing. It's like somebody would come and say, "Oh yeah, this is so tough." It's like, "Oh, this is really bothering me." Blah blah. So when you have challenges, you should be jubilant. Yes, this is fantastic. Now I'm learning something, right? And many people will say, it's like, yeah, Gabriel is crazy. He thinks we should
right,
celebrate when we have difficulties. So
right.
uh,
Yeah,
just this,
that's a huge
just
shift for
this,
a lot of people
like
to
within
think
the
that way.
last year, there was a person who also has been into pranic healing a long time, and he came to me and said, I want to thank you. Like 20 years ago, I thought you were crazy. Celebrate when I have difficulties, but I started to apply it, and my life has completely changed. And that was very nice
Mm,
to hear. Uh, Many
yeah,
times you don't. It's like
that's
I don't see exactly what people are going through. So when they come back and it meant something to them, that was an affirmation for me that okay, that's a good approach.
right. That's and in pranic healing and when you do any type of practice, again, it's a practice because you practice it. And what we've been talking about is the differences between the emotional body and the mental body and how we can use it to, improve our lives and not have to kind of go through the typical problems that most people deal with. And one of the things that you mentioned is that through the practice, you can see the results for yourself, but for other people, when you communicate with them, from your perspective, the teachings, they also get better. And it takes time, but eventually they come back to you and like, oh, they're grateful for who you were and how you communicated the ideas to them,
Yeah,
and it benefited their life. And I think that's a very common testimonial across chronic healing
yeah.
because sometimes you see the direct results, but the indirect results may take years to come back, which is even more rewarding at the end. So,
Absolutely.
so Gabriel, we're running low on time.
Okay.
We're getting towards the end of the show, but I think we've had a really fantastic discussion on the emotional body and the mental body, and your history and background in pranic healing, and getting to where you're at now. I see that, especially in pranic healing and arhatic yoga, you are definitely more of the balanced person in terms of your thoughts and your emotions, right? Very logical, but very uh, tamed in your feelings too, and you can sort through the details very nicely. So I know we've discussed some of the tools or ways that we can apply this to our life, using verbal Tai Chi. But if for someone off the street, someone that doesn't know about the mental body, doesn't know about the emotional body, just your average Joe, what kind of piece of advice would you give them to help them in their life overcome emotional and mental challenges that we typically face?
Yeah. The starting from just a ground level of not having done any pranic healing or anything, the most important practice is forgiveness. And in pranic healing, we divide forgiveness into two camps: proactive and reactive. There are those words again. So when we need to do forgiveness to other people that bother us, but we don't need to do it to their face. So we imagine them, and when we do the forgiveness meditation to others, and that's a proactive measure. So, for instance, if you're going to have a meeting with a person that it's like it always ends up in an argument, then you do a forgiveness meditation to them before you go to see them, and then so that's proactive. Reactive is forgiveness to myself. So whenever you do something and say, why did I do that? When we hammer ourselves, that's when you do forgiveness to yourself. And the most important part of it is that, and there's a specific text for this: I promise to try better next time. Because if I said, okay, I'll never do that again, it's like, okay, that's a lie. I'm going to break that one. Uh, so it is that's a working on ourselves. Because whenever we hammer ourselves, it's like we lose energy. It's like, I don't need this energy. I'll throw it on the bonfire. It's like, I'm going to drive to Boston. Let me make a bonfire of the gasoline. I'm not going to get very far. So I would say that forgiveness is like fundamentally the really, really important part for self evolution. And
Mm.
so for those of you who are listening, you can contact Jason, and he can give you the text to those.
Yeah. Um, that was an amazing answer. I don't think that was the answer I was expecting, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think that it was such a simple way to connect again back to the emotions and the thoughts, just how you did with we spoke earlier about compassion. I find that forgiveness is another way that we can kind of bridge the mediums between the thoughts and the
Yeah,
emotions. Again, not only with ourselves and forgiving ourselves when we make mistakes, but to others when we've had a history of conflict with them. And I think that for many people, it might seem so obvious, but it is, again, when we talk about common sense, um, forgiveness is one of the key teachings that we learn in pranic healing,
yeah.
because it's able to deal with these things on so many different levels,
I
and
mean,
levels that we haven't even spoken of when it comes to
so
our emotions and
the
thoughts.
only addition I would make is that forgiveness to others and forgiveness to self is is an act of compassion.
Mm.
It,
Okay.
it is putting compassion into practice. I'm being
Right.
compassionate to them, and I'm being compassionate to myself.
Ah, I like that. So forgiveness is sort of, remember how we spoke about the function of the emotional body, mental body, and the
Yeah,
language. So it sounds like forgiveness is the language of compassion. It's
yeah,
putting compassion
yeah,
into action.
yeah.
Okay. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Gabriel. It's been an hour, and I learned so much from you, and I'm sure everyone else did,
Thank you.
because this is such an important topic. As you know, because as you mentioned, 80% of people are emotionally polarized or attached to or
Yeah,
identified. And if we can just increase the awareness, right, of the mental part and how we can use both of them in our lives, I think that in the future there is so much conflict we can avoid. And then vice versa, we can create so much progress and resolution and evolution from that as well.
yeah.
So, and I thank you for your time, Gabriel.
My
It
pleasure.
was a excellent talk. And then, in the future, I would love to invite you again on another topic, because you are a library of information, as we know, for our pranic healers that know you. So I'm grateful for your time and for the opportunity for you to present the topics that we discussed today. So that's all for this episode. My namaste, everyone, and we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.